Don't just sit there drinking that wine while I'm talking to you.
I know what you want.
Sign these divorce papers and don't cry in front of me, sweetie.
Who invited her to our wedding? I didn't, I swear.
Listen, you look amazing.
Yeah.
I want you back. Give me one more night with you.
You didn't lose me, Ethan, and you lost the version of me that used to beg to be understood.
I am sorry for treating you like that.
Come here, baby. Ethan Cole's voice was low and smooth as he crooked a finger toward his wife. The penthouse lights glowed softly behind him, reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain slid slowly down the glass while jazz music played quietly somewhere in the background. Scarlet Cole stood near the dining table, still wearing the black dress she had spent 2 hours choosing for him. Their anniversary dinner sat untouched behind her. Candles burned low. The food had gone cold, just like the marriage. Still, her heart reacted stupidly when he called her baby again. It had been weeks. Weeks since he touched her first. Weeks since he looked at her like a husband instead of a man already halfway gone. Scarlet walked toward him slowly. Ethan's eyes moved over her face with unreadable calm. Then suddenly, his hand slid around her waist and pulled her tightly against his chest. Scarlet gasped softly from the sudden movement. A smirk touched Ethan's lips. There she is. His fingers pressed possessively against her waist, while his other hand lifted slowly to her jaw. For one tiny second, it felt normal again. Familiar. Dangerously familiar. Then he kissed her, slowly, deeply, cruelly, the kind of kiss that confuses your heart, even while your mind is screaming, "Something is wrong." Scarlet melted into it before she could stop herself, because this was her husband, the man she had loved for 7 years, the man whose voice still lived inside her chest, the man she stayed awake worrying about while he slowly stopped coming home. And for one pathetic moment, she thought maybe he missed her too. Maybe tonight was going to change everything. Maybe he finally realized what he was losing. Ethan pulled away slowly. His forehead rested lightly against hers. "You know something?" he murmured softly. Scarlet's breathing was uneven. "What?" A lazy smile spread across his face. "I'm really going to miss this face." Confusion flickered across her expression. Before she could speak, Ethan suddenly stepped back and threw a thick stack of papers directly against her chest. The pages scattered across the marble floor. Scarlet froze. Her heartbeat stopped. "Divorce agreement." The words blurred for a second. The room went completely silent except for the rain outside. Ethan calmly adjusted the sleeve of his black suit, like he had just finished discussing a business deal instead of destroying a marriage. "I want a divorce," he said casually. Scarlet stared at him. He walked toward the bar cart near the windows and poured himself whiskey. No guilt, no hesitation, nothing. "Try not to make this dramatic, okay?" he continued lazily. "You always get emotional when things don't go your way." Scarlet slowly looked down at the papers near her heels. 7 years, reduced to signatures. Her throat tightened painfully. "You kissed me," she whispered. Ethan laughed quietly into his whiskey glass. "Consider it a goodbye gift. That hurt more than the divorce itself." Scarlet looked at him carefully now. Really looked at him. The expensive watch, the arrogant posture, the calm confidence of a man who believed he would never lose anything important, especially not her. "You're unbelievable," she said softly. Ethan leaned casually against the bar. "No, Scarlet," he corrected smugly. "I'm honest. That's the difference." Lightning flashed outside the windows. For a second, the entire penthouse lit up white. Scarlet folded her arms tightly around herself. "When were you planning to tell me?" Ethan took a sip of whiskey. After Paris. Her stomach dropped. Paris. So it was true. All those pictures online. The blonde influencer wrapped around him outside luxury hotels. The business partner everyone kept whispering about. Scarlet forced herself to ask anyway. How long? Ethan barely blinked. 8 months. The answer sliced through her chest. 8 months. 8 months of lies. 8 months of fake meetings. 8 months of sleeping beside her while loving someone else. And somehow the worst part was how calm he looked admitting it. Scarlet laughed softly under her breath. Not because anything was funny, because heartbreak sometimes becomes too heavy for tears. Ethan misunderstood the laugh immediately. Oh, come on, he sighed dramatically. Don't start acting emotionally mature now. You knew this marriage was dead. Scarlet slowly lifted her eyes toward him. No, she said quietly. You killed it. For the first time all night, Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but only for a second. Men like him recovered quickly. There's the attitude I'm talking about, he mocked. Always making me the villain instead of accepting reality. Scarlet stared at him in disbelief. Reality? She repeated softly. You cheated on me. Ethan shrugged carelessly. And you stopped being someone I wanted to come home to. The words hit harder than she expected. Not because she believed them, because once upon a time, she would have destroyed herself trying to fix them. Ethan walked closer again, whiskey glass still in his hand. You know what your problem is? He asked smugly. Scarlet stayed silent. You built your whole identity around being my wife. He gestured around the penthouse. The clothes, the trips, the status, this life. His eyes locked onto hers coldly. Without me, what exactly are you? The silence after that felt endless. Scarlet remembered every lonely dinner she ate alone, while Ethan entertained models and investors. Every vacation where he answered emails instead of speaking to her. Every moment she slowly made herself smaller, trying to become easier to love. And suddenly, she felt exhausted, not angry, not hysterical, just tired. Tired of begging for attention from a man addicted to admiration. Ethan noticed her silence and smirked again. That's what I thought. Then casually, Olivia said you'd react like this. Scarlet's fingers tightened instantly. Olivia Hart, 25 years old, social media princess, millions of followers, perfect body, perfect hair, perfect little trophy for a man terrified of aging. Scarlet had seen her pictures long before Ethan confessed. You talk about me to her? She asked quietly. Ethan laughed softly. She listens better than you ever did. That sentence should have shattered her. Instead, it made something inside her finally go cold. Scarlet walked slowly toward the scattered divorce papers. Ethan watched confidently. He expected crying now, expected begging, expected emotional collapse. Instead, Scarlet calmly bent down and picked up the papers one by one, smoothly, silently. That unsettled him slightly. You're taking this surprisingly well, he admitted. Scarlet looked up at him. Her eyes were glossy now, but not weak. You already destroyed this marriage months ago, she said softly. You just didn't have the courage to admit it until now. Ethan rolled his eyes. Please don't start with a victim speech. Scarlet ignored him. You know what's funny? She continued quietly. I spent years thinking if I loved you enough, you'd eventually love me the same way. Ethan took another sip of whiskey. And? A small sad smile touched her lips. And now I realize you only loved people who made you feel important. Something about that sentence irritated him instantly. That's not true. Scarlet laughed softly again. No? She looked around the penthouse slowly. You don't love people, Ethan. Her eyes returned to his. You love admiration. For the first time that night, he looked affected, only slightly. But Scarlet noticed. She used to notice everything about him. That was the problem. Ethan set his whiskey glass down harder than necessary. You think you sound wise right now? No, Scarlet answered calmly. I think I sound tired. The rain outside grew heavier. Thunder rolled somewhere across the city. Ethan looked at her carefully now, maybe for the first time in years. And suddenly, he realized she wasn't breaking. That bothered him more than tears would have, because deep down, he expected her world to end without him in it. You'll regret this divorce, he said coldly. Scarlet's expression didn't change. No, she replied softly. I'll regret loving someone who needed me smaller just to feel big. The room fell silent, completely silent. Ethan stared at her. Scarlet looked back calmly, and neither of them understood yet. That 3 years later, the woman standing barefoot in heartbreak tonight would walk into his second wedding so powerful that even breathing near her would make him question every mistake he ever made. The divorce papers were signed 3 days later. No arguments, no emotional breakdowns, no last-minute apology, just silence. Scarlet Cole sat in the same penthouse Ethan used to own with her, watching him pack his final suitcase like he was checking out of a hotel, not a marriage, not a life. A hotel. Ethan adjusted his watch. Completely calm. I've arranged everything with lawyers, he said without looking at her. You'll get the apartment for 6 months. After that, it's yours or you sell it. Doesn't matter to me. Scarlet didn't respond. She stood near the window, staring at Manhattan like it belonged to someone else now. Maybe it did. Ethan zipped his suitcase, then paused at the door. For a moment, Scarlet thought he might say something different, something human, something real. Instead, he glanced back and smirked. You handled this better than I expected. Pause, I guess I overestimated how much you cared. That sentence didn't hurt like before, it just confirmed something. She was already starting to understand. Ethan didn't know her at all. Scarlet finally turned her head. Slightly. You didn't overestimate anything, she said quietly. You just never looked properly. Ethan scoffed. Don't start this philosophical phase now. It doesn't suit you. He opened the door, and just like that, he was gone. The lock clicked softly behind him, and the penthouse fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical. Scarlet stood there for a long time, minutes, maybe hours. She didn't cry. Immediately, that came later, much later. Right now, she just felt empty, like someone had removed a chapter from her life and forgotten to tell her how to continue reading. The first week after Ethan left was the hardest, not because she missed him, but because everything still remembered him. His coffee, mug in the kitchen, his cologne in the bedroom, his name still appearing on shared accounts, even the city lights outside the window felt like they belonged to the version of her that used to wait for him. On the 4th night, Scarlet finally broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly sitting on the cold marble floor of the bathroom, holding her knees to her chest while the shower ran for no reason at all. And for the first time in years, she didn't have to pretend she was okay. But pain, strangely, doesn't stay the same forever. It shifts, it softens, and then it turns into something else. Anger, clarity, awakening. 2 weeks later, Scarlet walked into a small cafe in Brooklyn wearing a plain coat, no makeup, and a tired expression she didn't bother hiding anymore. She ordered coffee, sat alone, and opened her laptop. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a long time. Then she typed, Investment Basics Course, Week 1. That was the moment everything quietly changed. Because Ethan Cole thought she would fall apart without him, but what he never knew was Scarlet had already been quietly watching him for years. The meetings she attended but never spoke in, the investors she listened to while he ignored her presence, the financial discussions she memorized while pretending not to understand. He thought she was background noise in his success story. She was actually studying the system he built. That night in the cafe, she didn't feel powerful yet, not even close. She just felt curious. For the first time in years, her life didn't revolve around someone else's voice. 3 months passed, then 6. Scarlet stopped answering emotional phone calls, stopped checking Ethan's social media, stopped waiting for anything that resembled closure. And slowly, she started building something of her own. At first, it was small freelance consulting, tiny investments, late-night courses, mistakes. She fixed quietly without telling anyone. But Scarlet wasn't starting from zero, she was starting from experience, and pain is a brutal but effective teacher. One evening, her old friend Maya came over and found her surrounded by financial reports and notebooks. Maya blinked. Okay, who are you and what did you do with the crying wife I used to know? Scarlet didn't look up. She left. Maya sat down slowly. That's actually terrifying, Scarlet finally smiled faintly. Good, because something inside her had changed. She no longer wanted to be loved in a way that required her to shrink. She wanted to build a life that didn't need permission. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole was doing exactly what he always did, winning her. So he thought. He appeared in magazines, attended galas, posted pictures with Olivia, hard on luxury vacations, perfect couple, perfect life, perfect illusion. But success has a strange habit. It gets quieter when there's no one left who truly knows you, and Ethan started noticing something he didn't expect. Scarlet wasn't reacting anymore, no messages, no emotional calls, no indirect attempts to reach him, nothing. At first, it pleased him, then it confused him. Then it started to bother him because Ethan had built his entire ego on one belief. She would never move on before him, but she already had, and he didn't even realize it yet. One night at a business gala, Ethan stood near the bar with a glass of whiskey when someone mentioned her name. Scarlet Cole, a businessman said casually. She's been making moves in the investment space lately. Ethan paused. Scarlet? The man nodded. Yeah, smart woman. Quiet but sharp. People are starting to notice her work. Ethan smirked. She's playing investor now? The man shrugged. More like becoming one. Something in Ethan's expression tightened slightly, but he recovered quickly. She'll get bored, he said. She always did. But for the first time, he didn't fully believe it because somewhere deep down a thought he didn't like was starting to grow. What if she wasn't waiting to come back? What if she never intended to? And somewhere across the city that same night, Scarlet closed a deal on her first independent portfolio, then leaned back in her chair. No celebration, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet breath. Because she was finally starting to understand something important. Healing doesn't announce itself, it just slowly replaces the person you used to be. And the woman Ethan Cole thought would break without him was no longer in the breaking phase anymore. 2 years later, Ethan Cole stood in front of a glass conference table, listening to investors talk about numbers he no longer fully cared about. He used to enjoy this. Power, control, being the smartest person in the room. But lately, something felt off. Ethan, are you with us? One of the board members asked. He blinked. Yeah, continue, but his mind had already drifted again. It had been happening more often, at random moments, in meetings, in elevators, in silence. Scarlet. Not the broken version he remembered. Not the quiet wife who used to wait for him, but the absence of her. That was the part he couldn't understand. Because Ethan had expected anger, drama, maybe even revenge, but what he got instead was nothing. Complete silence. And silence, he was learning, is louder than any fight. That evening, he sat in his penthouse with Olivia Hart scrolling through her phone while she talked about some brand event. Ethan wasn't listening. Olivia noticed. You've been distracted a lot lately, she said, narrowing her eyes. I'm fine, he replied automatically. But he wasn't. Not really. Because earlier that day, his assistant had shown him something that didn't sit right. Financial magazine cover. Small headline. But enough to freeze him for a second. Rising star in private investments, Scarlet Cole. His ex-wife. Standing in a black suit. Calm expression. Sharp eyes. Completely different from the woman he remembered. Olivia. Leaned over. Oh, she said casually. That's your ex, right? Ethan didn't answer immediately. That silence told her everything. She looks successful, Olivia added, half interested, half dismissive. Ethan finally spoke. Everyone looked successful in magazines, but his voice lacked confidence. That night, he couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't thinking about deals or women or money. He was thinking about her. The way she looked at him the last time they met. Not broken, not angry, just done. And somehow, That bothered him more than anything she could have done. Meanwhile, Scarlet Cole stood in a high-rise office overlooking Manhattan. Her office. Not borrowed. Space. Not shared life. Hers. She was reviewing acquisition files when her assistant knocked softly. "Ma'am, the Zurich partners are ready for tomorrow's call." Scarlet nodded without looking up. "Prepare the documents. I want full details." "Yes, ma'am." The assistant hesitated for a second before adding, "And Ethan Cole's company has shown interest in one of our deals." That made her pause. Slowly, she looked up. For a moment, the room felt still. "What did you say?" The assistant swallowed slightly. "His firm is trying to enter the same investment round as us." Silence. Then Scarlet leaned back in her chair, not shocked, not emotional, just aware. "I see," she said calmly. The assistant waited. "Should I block them?" he asked carefully. Scarlet thought for a moment, then shook her head slightly. "No." A pause. "Let them come." That was all she said, because Scarlet wasn't the woman Ethan used to control anymore. She wasn't the wife who needed permission to exist in the same world as him. She was now part of the world he was trying to enter, and he didn't even know it yet. That night, Ethan received a call from his board. "Ethan, we have a problem." He frowned. "What problem?" There was a pause. "The Cole Investment Group is leading the same deal we're targeting." Ethan straightened slightly. "Cole? As in Scarlet Cole?" "Yes." Silence, longer this time. Then Ethan laughed lightly. "Relax. She's new in this. She'll step aside when she sees real pressure." But, even as he said it, something inside him wasn't sure anymore, because the name Scarlet Cole no longer sounded like the woman he divorced. It sounded like competition. The next day, they met again, not at home, not emotionally, in a corporate boardroom overlooking the city. Ethan walked in. First, confident, sharp. Suit, perfect posture. The man who used to own every room he entered until she walked in. Scarlet. Cole entered quietly. No dramatic entrance, no hesitation. Black. Tailored suit, minimal makeup, calm expression, and behind her, 2 senior partners and a legal team that immediately made the atmosphere shift. Ethan noticed it. Instantly, she wasn't alone. She wasn't vulnerable. She wasn't anything he remembered. Their eyes met. For the first time in 2 years. Ethan smiled. Slightly. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. Casually, Scarlet didn't return the smile. "I can say the same," she replied. Calmly, the room went silent. Investors looked between them, sensing history but not knowing how deep it went. Ethan leaned slightly forward. "You're competing now?" Scarlet tilted her head. "I've been competing for a while," she said softly. "You just weren't paying attention." That sentence hit differently because it wasn't emotional, it was factual. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "You're still new in this world," he said. Scarlet met his eyes steadily. "No," she corrected. "I was just never visible in yours." For the first time, Ethan didn't have an immediate response, because this wasn't the woman he left behind. This was someone else, someone built from silence, from observation, from everything he ignored. And as the meeting began, Ethan realized something he didn't like admitting. He was no longer the only powerful person in the room, and worse, he might not even be the most dangerous one anymore. Across the table, Scarlet opened her file calmly, and without looking at him, she said softly, "Let's begin." And just like that, the balance between them shifted forever. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the glass tower felt different that day. Not because of the view, not because of the money involved, but because of the 2 people sitting on opposite sides of the table, who used to share a life and now shared nothing except history that neither of them could ignore anymore. Ethan Cole sat with his usual controlled posture, suit perfectly tailored, watch glinting under the soft lights, expression calm on the surface but slightly tighter than usual. While across from him, Scarlet Cole sat in a way that didn't ask for permission from the room, her presence quiet but firm, no longer the woman who used to look at him first before making decisions, no longer the wife who softened herself to fit into his world. She was now someone who had built her own version of that world and was learning how to own it completely, and the investors around the table could feel it even if they didn't understand it fully. Because there is a certain shift in energy when someone who was once underestimated returns not for validation, but for position. The meeting had started professionally. Numbers, projections, acquisition percentages, legal frameworks, all the usual language of high-level deals. But underneath every sentence there was something unspoken moving between Ethan and Scarlet. Something sharp and quiet like an old wound that no longer bleeds but still remembers being cut. Ethan spoke first when discussion turned technical, his tone smooth and confident as he outlined his company's offer. He was used to controlling narratives in rooms like this, used to being the one people leaned toward when decisions mattered. But when he finished speaking and the room turned slightly toward Scarlet for her response, there was a pause. A small one, but enough for him to notice that she didn't rush. She simply opened her file, placed it neatly on the table, and looked at the data in front of her as if she had already seen 10 versions of this conversation before. When Scarlet finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It carried the kind of clarity that comes from understanding numbers without needing to impress anyone with them. She broke down risk exposure, long-term yield stability, market timing, and cross-border implications in a way that made even the senior investors glance at each other slightly differently. Because she wasn't just responding, she was positioning, and Ethan realized slowly that she wasn't trying to beat him emotionally or personally. She was simply operating in the same space as him with equal competence, maybe even more precision. And that realization unsettled him more than any argument ever could. Because Ethan had prepared himself for a woman who might come back angry or broken or emotional, not one who came back strategic. At one point during the discussion, an investor asked Scarlet a direct question about why her firm was confident entering the same acquisition lane as Cole Enterprises. And there was a brief silence before she answered, not because she didn't know, but because she chose her words carefully. And when she spoke, she didn't mention Ethan, didn't reference history, didn't allow the past to become part of her professional argument. Instead, she said her company doesn't follow opportunities. It evaluates them independently, and if two firms arrive at the same conclusion, then competition is not personal, it is structural, and that line alone subtly repositioned the entire room, because she had removed emotion from the equation entirely, while Ethan still felt it sitting somewhere under his ribs even though he refused to acknowledge it. Ethan leaned forward slightly after that, trying to regain conversational control. His voice calm but with a sharper edge when he asked whether Scarlet believed her firm had enough experience to handle the scale of the acquisition. And this was the moment where everyone in the room instinctively became more alert. Because this wasn't just business language anymore. It carried history, but Scarlet didn't react the way she used to in the past when he would challenge her. She didn't defend, she didn't justify, she simply looked at him for a brief second, long enough for him to feel that she was seeing him fully now. Not as the man she once loved, but as a competitor who underestimated her before and was now recalculating. And then she answered calmly that experience is not always measured in years. Sometimes it is measured in exposure, and exposure to failure, to observation, and to silence often builds stronger judgment than comfort ever does. That sentence lingered in the room longer than expected, and Ethan felt it even though no one else seemed to react outwardly. Because he understood what she meant without her having to explain it. She was referring to everything she had gone through while he lived comfortably, believing she was simply his wife. And the worst part for him was not that she was accusing him. It was that she wasn't accusing him at all. She had already moved past the need to do that, and that emotional distance made him feel something unfamiliar. Not guilt exactly, but displacement. Like the ground he used to stand on was no longer solid. The meeting continued. Terms were debated. Counteroffers were placed on the table. Analysts whispered into devices. Lawyers adjusted clauses. But the real negotiation was happening silently between two people who were no longer negotiating love or resentment but positioning. And every now and then Ethan would catch small details about Scarlet that didn't match the version of her he carried in his memory. The way she didn't look at him for validation before speaking, the way she paused to listen rather than react, the way she didn't fill silence with discomfort anymore. And each detail added up into something he didn't want to name yet. When the meeting finally paused for a short break, Ethan stepped out first into the corridor, expecting perhaps to feel relief, but instead he felt a strange heaviness that he couldn't place properly, and when he turned slightly, he saw Scarlet standing near the glass window inside the room, looking out at the city below without any trace of emotional conflict on her face. Just focus. And for a brief moment he remembered a version of her that used to stand like that in their old penthouse. Except back then she used to turn around if he left the room. Now she didn't even notice he had stopped. That was the first time Ethan realized something he had been avoiding since the divorce. Scarlet was no longer reacting to him, because he was no longer central in her internal world. And that realization didn't feel like losing a person. It felt like losing relevance, which for a man like him was far more uncomfortable than loss itself. And as he stood there watching her from a distance, he understood without wanting to accept it, that the story he thought he had finished 3 years ago was still being written, just without him holding the pen anymore. The entire estate was glowing with luxury, white flowers covering every arch, soft music floating through the air, and guests dressed like they were attending the most important social event of the year. Because for Ethan Cole it was supposed to be exactly that, a statement of success, a celebration of moving on, and a public declaration that his past no longer mattered. Ethan stood near the entrance with Olivia Hart beside him, greeting guests with practiced charm, smiling at compliments, shaking hands with investors, playing the role of a man who had everything perfectly aligned. But underneath that perfect expression was a quiet expectation he didn't admit even to himself. That Scarlet would not come. Because in his mind she was still the woman who would avoid discomfort, avoid confrontation, avoid anything that made her emotionally vulnerable in front of him. But then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced, it was subtle, like the way conversations slowly lose rhythm when something important enters a room. A black car stopped at the entrance, not part of the wedding convoy, not part of the guest list, just different. Security noticed first, then guests. Then silence started spreading in uneven waves across the garden area. Ethan's smile didn't drop immediately, but something in his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the car door open. And then Scarlet Cole stepped out. For a second, nobody reacted properly because the version of her standing there didn't match memory, expectation, or assumption. She wasn't the woman who used to stand behind him in social events. She wasn't the wife who looked uncertain in expensive rooms she walked in like she belonged there more than anyone else. Simple black dress, no excessive jewelry, calm posture, controlled expression. But it wasn't the outfit that changed the atmosphere. It was her presence. People started whispering before she even took her second step. Is that Ethan's ex-wife? No way she looks like that now. I thought she disappeared after the divorce. Ethan heard it, every word. Slowly, his hand tightened slightly around his glass. Olivia leaned in, confused. That's her? Ethan didn't answer immediately, because he was still processing something he didn't expect. She wasn't looking at him, not even once. Scarlet walked forward calmly, past guests who instinctively made space without realizing why, her eyes scanning the venue once, not searching for him, but understanding the room like she was evaluating a deal, not revisiting a memory. And that was the moment it hit. Ethan, she wasn't here emotionally, she was here deliberately. Scarlet finally reached the main area near the fountain, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and stood there completely composed as if she had attended events like this her entire life. And slowly, people started recognizing her, not as Ethan Cole's ex-wife, but as something else. A businessman near the bar whispered, "That's Scarlet Cole, the one from Cole Investment Group." Another turned quickly. "She runs that? I thought it was just starting out." "No, she expanded into 3 markets this year." The whispers changed tone, from curiosity to respect, and Ethan felt it shift, because the room was no longer looking at her as his past. They were looking at her as her own identity. Olivia noticed it immediately. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Why is everyone acting like she's some celebrity?" But Ethan didn't reply, because Scarlet's eyes finally moved and landed on him. For the first time that night, no smile, no anger, no hesitation, just a calm acknowledgement, like seeing someone from another life that no longer had emotional access. Then, she looked away, that was it, no reaction, no pause, nothing. And somehow that silence hit harder than any confrontation ever Could because Ethan had expected pain or jealousy or breakdown, but what he got instead was irrelevance. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole felt something unfamiliar in a room he used to own completely. He felt replaced. The wedding had officially begun, but Ethan Cole was no longer hearing the music the same way everyone else did, because his attention kept slipping back to the woman who had arrived without announcing herself, yet somehow became the center of every whispered conversation in the estate. Scarlet stood near the fountain in quiet composure, holding a glass of water, speaking occasionally to investors who approached her first, not the other way around. And that small detail kept repeating in Ethan's mind like a glitch he couldn't fix. Because for years he had believed people came to him, not around him, not past him, and definitely not towards someone he once thought would struggle without him. Olivia noticed his distraction growing worse and tried to pull him back into the moment. But Ethan's responses were delayed, mechanical, because every time he looked up he saw another guest recognizing Scarlet. Another handshake, another respectful nod, another conversation where his name was not the main subject anymore. And slowly the narrative he had built around his own importance started to crack in subtle but irreversible ways. He had expected her to be quiet, possibly uncomfortable, maybe even emotionally shaken by being in the same space as him again. But instead she looked like someone attending a professional gathering, where Ethan just happened to be another name on the guest list. Scarlet, on the other hand, remained completely steady, as if nothing in this environment had the power to disturb her balance. And when she finally moved away from the fountain and walked through the crowd, people instinctively adjusted their positions around her without realizing it, because confidence that does not seek attention always ends up receiving it anyway. Ethan watched that movement carefully, noticing how she didn't rush, didn't search for validation, didn't try to prove anything. And that absence of emotional noise was what unsettled him most, because he remembered a version of her that used to look at him for approval without even realizing it. And now that version felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. At one point their eyes met across the garden again, and Ethan instinctively straightened slightly as if preparing for something. A reaction, a recognition, anything that would confirm he still existed in her emotional space. But Scarlet only held his gaze for a brief second, calm and unreadable, like looking at a familiar place she no longer lived in, and then she turned away first without hesitation. That single moment created a strange silence inside Ethan's mind, because it wasn't rejection that hurt him. It was the absence of importance in her reaction, as if he had become irrelevant in a story he once believed he controlled. Olivia finally spoke more sharply, asking him what exactly was going on and why he looked like he had lost focus at his own wedding event. But Ethan couldn't answer properly because for the first time, he didn't have a narrative that made him feel in control of the situation. Across the venue, guests continued to discuss Scarlet's presence, her business, her growth, her reputation, and each sentence added another layer of discomfort to Ethan's realization that she had built something after him that did not require him in any form, not as support, not as reference, not even as memory. And then it happened, the moment that shifted everything completely, when a senior investor approached Scarlet directly in front of several guests and greeted her with clear respect, mentioning her firm and asking for a follow-up meeting in a tone that carried admiration rather than formality. And Ethan watched it from a distance as if his brain was refusing to fully process what he was seeing. Because this was not the dynamic he remembered, this was not the outcome he had subconsciously expected. And most importantly, this was not a woman who needed to be seen through his presence anymore. For the first time that night, Ethan didn't feel like the groom at the center of a celebration. He felt like someone standing slightly outside a conversation that had moved on without him. And that realization settled in slowly, heavily, without drama, without explosion, just a quiet internal collapse of assumptions he had never questioned before. Scarlet wasn't there to prove she had moved on from him. She was there to show she had built something that never needed him in the first place. And that difference was what finally made Ethan understand that losing her had never been the end of her story. It had only been the beginning of his misunderstanding.